Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to first of the 3 evenings of Timothy Hoft's premiere performance, world premiere performance of the complete 34 Preludes and Fugues by the Ukrainian composer Valentin Bibik. Bibik was born in 1940, died in 2003, and he's a composer that I got to know for the first time in 1974, I met. And then the next time I saw him was in 1986. He gave me these Preludes and Fugues, 3 books, 3 particular wonderful books of the 34 Preludes and Fugues. And since then, after going over them, I've been trying to find a pianist who agreed to do all of them, all 34 of them. It required a certain kind of madness to do that. And I found the appropriate mad individual right here. And so Timothy and I have been involved now for about 4 years, in maybe even longer, maybe 5.
6 years, almost 6 years.
Of actual presenting music from Ukraine. And he has put out now the first of the 6 volumes of recordings. Volume 2 and 3 are already done and will be out in a couple of months. And so what we want to do right now is give you a little I'm going to give you a little back history on this whole idea of where this whole, one we might call it a genre, comes from. Of course, the most famous one is the Well-Tempered of Bach, which is 48 of them altogether between the 2 books. But in Europe, in the last 100 or so years, the idea of writing preludes and fugues became not that common. But in Eastern Europe and in the former Soviet Union, it became something that a number of composers tried their hands at. Not all of them completed it. Excuse me. Probably the first one to do it in the 20th century was a composer most of you will not know, Arkady Filipenko, who in the early 30s composed 24 Preludes and Fugues. And he was a composer that lived in Kiev. After that is a composer called Vsevolod Zadaratsky. Now, Vsevolod Zadaratsky composed his 24 Preludes and Fugues while serving a term of imprisonment in Gulag between 1937 and 38. He composed them on telegram papers. If you go to the website, you can find his name, Vsevolod Zadaratsky, and you can discover that. They have been recorded recently, and it's a unique document, partly because of where they were written. We know another famous piece, also actually much more famous piece, The Court for the End of Time by Messiaen, which was written in prison, in concentration camp. And then Hindemith Ludus Tonalis, which was written in 1939. And then in 1953 is the quite famous by Shostakovich, 24 Preludes and Fugues. In more recent times, besides Bibik, we have Rodion Shchedrin, who has written a number of them, but in a very unique manner too. They're not even called necessarily Preludes and Fugues per se, but they have this grouping that it's also available that you can get a hold of. So Bibik's, in my opinion, was a work that merited attention and merited recording and merited performances. But like many works, they need to find their time and their performer. And I think tonight you will discover both the time and the performer. Now I'm going to ask Tim a few questions now, and we'll have a conversation. My monologue has ended. So, why were you interested in tackling it even?
Well, I've always had a great fascination with the well-tempered clavier. of Bach. It has always been my desert island work ever since I was a child. And so I grew up with that work, and I've always loved the fugue as a form. It's always been a favorite genre of mine. I like the way that they're constructed. I like the manner in which one can perform them and analyze them and just keep digging and digging into them. And you keep learning something new each time you perform them. And through Bach, I became interested in fugues all throughout the centuries, and became most interested in Schedrin's Preludes and Fugues, though I never learned them, but I did test them out a few times. And then when you gave me the score to the 34 Preludes and Fugues of Bibik, it didn't take long for the score to pop out in my eyes. I actually did not play it through. I think if you remember, you gave me the score, and then the next day you asked me to give it back to you because you needed it for something. So I only had a day with the score, and I hadn't played through it at all. But just looking at it and seeing what he had done with the form and its uniqueness, it was really apparent to me just on the first viewing without having heard the pieces. So I think I remember I told you it didn't take long for me to see the value in it, and I really believed that it was a great monumental work just by looking at the score.
Can you tell me how you, in other words, in terms of audience listening, what would be, in a way, the manner by which one listens to a fugue? How would you compare a fugue? Is there any analog that you can think?
I think there's many ways to listen to a fugue. The easiest and most basic way is simply to pay attention at the beginning and listen to the subject, and then listen to when the subject goes down a fourth or fifth, and then listen for a third voice if it comes in, and a fourth voice if it comes in, and just follow the narrative, see what happens through that, and try your hardest to follow the story that's being told through the subjects. Usually at some point you're going to lose track at what's happening in the fugue, and you shouldn't be too worried at that point. You should just let go and just listen to the music for what it is. Usually what happens, and this happens with me all the time, even with Bach's fugues, at some point I do forget to follow every single voice, and I just kind of give up, and I just enjoy the overall perspective of the piece, the sounds that are coming out of the piece. If you are very interested in music theory and you become really excited over things like diminution and augmentation and retrograde, then you can listen to a fugue that way. If you are a layperson and you don't know much about music theory, it doesn't matter. You can still listen to fugues, and you can still appreciate it. I would even go further to say that with the Bibik fugues, I think in a way they're even easier to listen to without having studied the pieces in such a detailed manner. Because unlike some of the other pieces that you mentioned, like Hindemith, for example, which is a very academic set, Bibik's fugues are highly, highly dramatic. And they're often, they can be quite terrifying at sometimes. They can be quite slow, quite sparse. And his style really puts you on the edge of your seat if you are paying attention. And so in that way, one doesn't have to understand everything that's happening in the piece to really enjoy it.
Yeah, if I may add, I mean,
Yeah.
one way that I tried when I was teaching it also at a certain point in time, I would say that if you see fuga a tre, for three voices, it's like three people having a conversation.
Right.
The fugue was really born during the age of enlightenment, and that's really it personifies that
Right.
age, that idea of the belief that we could talk through anything, and that if you understand something, that will be enough to change your life.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very, very clear structure. We're going to do book one today, which is Prelude and Fugues, 14 altogether, 14 because each Prelude and Fugue is on one of the white keys of the piano. So it goes from C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and it's major and minor. Mm-hmm. So we have 14. And the difference is, somebody's asked me always, why 34? Well, tomorrow it'll be the black keys, 5, but I've seen only as sharps, major and minor. I believe it's sharps.
Yeah, sure.
And then the third day, is the same black keys seen as flats. So what you have is it's a different way of what the voice is leading. It's a different way of voice leading. Okay, can you illustrate some of the ideas that you would like to let the audience know that the fugues personify? For instance, the relationship between Bach, Shostakovich, because there's a quote of Shostakovich in one of them.
Right.
And then Bibik. How?
Okay.
Okay.
So, whoops. So you all know the well-tempered clavier of Bach. The first prelude in C major is one of the most famous pieces ever written, and this is the way it sounds. So Bach chooses this sound to start the well-tempered clavier. If I were to take those notes and block them, that's the sound world that he's interested at the very beginning. Fast forward to the 20th century to Dmitri Shostakovich and his 24 Preludes and Fugues, and there's a very clear reference. Instead of arpeggiating these chords, Shostakovich simply blocks them, as I've done, and he creates a piece out of it, which is also a saraband, which is a Baroque style. So this is a very clear reference to Baroque style and to Bach's first prelude. And so when one hears Shostakovich for the first time, that might escape your attention, but looking upon the music, it's very clear and it's very obvious that Shostakovich had Bach in mind. Now Bibik takes that a little bit further, but still I think it's quite clear that the beginning of his first prelude in C major is a reference to both Shostakovich and ultimately to Bach. So here's how the first prelude starts. And so with that example, Bibik takes the idea of the chords from Shostakovich's prelude and condenses them and makes them more into clusters. That's the first sound you hear. So in a way that's symbolic, that's Bibik telling you or foreshadowing the rest of the rest of the Preludes and Fugues and his style in general. You're going to hear a lot of clusters. You're going to hear a lot of dissonance. And this is the sound world that he's interested in. So.
Yeah, very good. Now, let me ask you if you can illustrate some of the other things.
Yeah.
For instance, one of the signature things that composers started using after Bach became well known, and it's something that Bach himself used, which is to write music on his name, B-A-C-H. Now you have to understand that in German, H is the same thing in Ha, which is on the piano our B. So B-A-C-H will be B flat, A, C, B. Can you play that? This is the typical Bach motif. Now, Bibik, I believe in number 8,
Yes.
uses it. Can you illustrate that?
In this case, he takes it out of order. Instead of having B-A-C-H, he does A-H-C-B. In other words, A-B-C, B flat.
Okay.
I would also add one other thing to this.
Okay, please.
It also reminds me a bit of the Bach fugue in C-sharp minor from Book 1. Which only has 4 pitches and it's very slow. So I think it comes from that as well.
It's also, I mean, many composers have utilized that. I mean, hundreds, literally. And a student of Schoenberg's, Anton Webern, used to build his 12-tone rows very often utilizing this as a tetrachord. What about the infamous reference to Scarlatti's The Cat Fugue?
Well, that's from Book 2. Maybe we should save that.
Well, but just to illustrate right now.
right.
Do you remember?
Sure.
I'm
All right,
throwing this one at him.
So if you know Scarlatti's Cat's Fugue, it's a very, very funny fugue subject. So it's a piece in G minor, and it breaks every single contrapuntal rule imaginable. You have G, B flat, which is fine, and then E flat, and E flat needs to resolve downwards, but it doesn't. He goes to F sharp. F sharp needs to resolve upwards by step. It doesn't. It goes to B flat, and B flat should probably stay there or go down to G, but no, he goes to C sharp, and then finally, he's a good composer.
Yeah. The story, I don't know how accurate it is, but it's a great story, was that one day Scarlatti's cat jumped on the piano and hit those notes, and he decided to make a piece out of that.
So yeah, there's a fugue by Bibik. This is Book 2. But it reminded me of the Cat's Fugue, and I have no idea if there's any relation, but it's just what I thought of. And this is the beginning of the fugue subject. It just goes up.
Right.
And it's hard to tell what key you're in, but if you look at the score, it's very clear that he's thinking of G sharp because he has F double sharps everywhere, and he's thinking of those as leading tones. But it takes a while for the listener to catch on, similar to Scarlatti's.
Yeah, it's the same kind, the games. The many games being played in these particular pieces. What about the wedge fugue?
The wedge fugue. I forgot how it goes with the Bach.
I'm sorry?
Do you remember the notes of the wedge fugue?
Not offhand.
Something like that, right? So it's this idea you have a single pitch, and then it gradually goes out, and then out, out.
Yeah.
Well, Fugue 12, Bibik does a similar thing, and I'll play the basic notes first. So the range is much wider, but on top of that, he adds these glissandos in between each one. So making it a very fun piece.
Yeah.
You're going to like this one.
And for me, the references, when I first got a hold of that and looked at it, reminded me a little bit of Nancarrow's glissandos.
Oh, yeah,
that,
sure.
that he liked to use. That just reminds me of that. And, okay, can we touch, we don't have much more time left, but we do have a little bit. You generally talked about the characters and images that the various fugues make, like you call number 6 snakes.
Right.
Does Adam know about that?
Adam? I don't know. Can we ask him?
We should.
Let me find number 6. So I think of snakes when I think of this fugue subject because it's very chromatic and it's very meandering, and he's constantly telling you to accelerate and ritardando, so there's not a stable sense of a pulse. It's also hard to tell what key we're in because it's so chromatic.
Spineless.
Yeah.
What about fugue number 9, which is a reference to Nancarrow?
The fugue or the prelude?
The prelude.
Prelude number 9?
I believe so. No, fugue number 9.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I don't know how many of you know the music of Nancarrow, but he ended up, stopped writing for live players and began to write a great amount of music for player piano. And the reason for that, he got tired of bad performances, I think. So he thought that a player piano would still create the acoustically live sound, but he would be able to do rather remarkably interesting things. I suggest very much that you look up. Most of them have been recorded and quite well. What about Terror, number 4?
Terror.
4.
Okay.
It's extraordinarily tense,
Yeah.
very intense.
Yeah.
Also very slow at the same time, but very lyrical, and I think very, very beautiful.
I also think of Terror with that one, not just with the fugue subject itself, but the way that the piece unfolds. It's a little bit like a horror movie in which it's very tense and very soft for a long amount of time, and you don't know
What's going to happen next?
what's going to happen next. And it does shock you when it does happen. So
What about Fugue 14,
14.
the last one that ends the program?
Oh, okay.
Pathos.
Right. So the piece that this reminds me of is from the Well-Tempered Clavier, B minor, Book 1, which is a very famous fugue by Bach because it uses all 12 pitches of the chromatic scale. it's also in B minor, and if you count up the keys in this book, C major, C minor, D major, D minor, the last one that we have is supposedly in B minor, although it can be hard to hear. So Bibik has the same level of chromaticism, and it also has the falling half-step motive that you hear everywhere. Whoops. So Bibik starts this way.
Yeah, I think the thing that appealed to me particularly when I got a hold of the music and I kind of went through them, and was that each one, they're really anti-academic pieces, or to make use of academic process. But the idea is that each piece a very, very clear image and a very, very clear, for lack of a better word, feeling behind it, or what Baroque people would say, an effect. A certain kind of specific thing, rather than just simply illustrating a key and illustrating a technique. It's not very objective music, it's extraordinarily subjective music,
Yeah.
which is the way Bibik wrote, period, and that's how he was. So,
And the way that he notates this music is also extremely subjective. He'll often have an entire page and only one dynamic, and he'll just leave all of the interpretation to the pianist. He really puts a lot of faith in the pianist. He's not a control freak like so many modern composers.
yeah. Well, no, not like Silvestro.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
Silvestrov's the worst. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, now, another reference is Lutosławski. Lutosławski, of course, wrote a rather famous book called Preludes and Fugue. He didn't write a series of fugues, but the Preludes and Fugues had quite an impact during the time when he wrote it in that whole decade. So that's another composer besides Shostakovich that Bibik actually quotes. This will be Prelude 11.
Prelude 11, he puts in a footnote that he gets the notes directly from Lutosławski's cello concerto. So if you know his cello concerto, you'll probably recognize this. And the whole prelude is for the left hand alone, and it very, very closely imitates the writing of a cello.
Beautiful. Any final thoughts about tonight's cycle, particularly Book 1, that you want to give the audience?
The exciting thing for me in learning these pieces is that I've slowly been seeing the architecture over the years. They're not the kind of pieces that you can just sight read from beginning to end. So I had to learn them one piece at a time over several years, and I sort of learned them in between other projects. And so the more of these I learned, the more I started recognizing Bibik's style over and over. And it's been extremely exciting for me this year to finally put all of them together and to see how the arcs work in each book. And each book really does have an arc. I think you will hear that tonight. Unlike Bach's, for example, like Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier Book 2, I don't think really has an arc. It sounds more like a collection of preludes and fugues that he just kind of assembled together. Bibik's 3 volumes were definitely conceived to be played in one setting.
Yeah, and they're also time-wise interesting because
Yeah.
book 1 is the longest, approximately 75 minutes. Book 2 is about an hour,
Yeah.
and book 3 is about 45, 50 minutes. So it's a kind of a. Oh. The last thing we should add is that each book has a subtitle. Again, it's extraordinarily programmatic that way, not in terms of telling a story, but in the book 1 is called Reflection, which is a reflection in temorozdum, which means thoughts. In some ways, the first one who wrote about them was Vsevolod Radaretsky's Jr., the son of the one who did the fugues in the Gulag. And he felt that they were more philosophical, more thoughts about the nature of prelude and fugue, exposing them all, each one being very, very different. Again, unlike Bach, in which we definitely feel the imprint of Baroque style. And here the styles vary. But in the end, as he said, once you get through all of it, you realize this was all written by one person.
Yeah.
We will now end our discussion, and in a few minutes, the program will begin. Thank you.